Hey everybody, this video is for 520. Yesterday we took a look at the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. Today we're going to focus just on the 15th Amendment. And then you have just a few questions to answer afterwards. 4 to be exact. Today's video is going to be relatively short. I'm going to read this aloud, maybe break a little bit for some explanation, and then we're going to answer these questions. Okay, anytime that we're doing a read aloud, we should probably do the questions first, but before that I want to remind you, make sure you're studying for the Bill of Rights exam next Wednesday by watching those videos and practicing all the things that go with them. Okay, right? All of those things will get you prepared for that, and more importantly, especially during this time of distance learning, you'll get to memorize those things. And so you'll know the Bill of Rights when you go and take your bar exam and become a lawyer in about 15 years, okay? You'll know those. So today, you should also be focusing on the overall test that's coming up. It's going to be the last day, or whenever you want to take it. I'll post it probably a little bit earlier in the week, next week. I'm going to share my screen with you, and I'm going to show you something hopefully you've already found. But if I go to Mr. Gooch's neighborhood and we click on civics test requirement, this is it. But this is also a lot of stuff that you can do to review. So here's an online practice test provided to you by the U.S. government. Here's a video series that goes through all 100 possible questions that you could get. You're only going to get 50 of them, but there are 50 out of these 100. Exactly the same, well, darn near exactly the same. Review flashcards. Awesome. 100 questions tested online. Same thing. Quizlet. These are all things that you should be doing to prepare for that naturalization test. It would be awesome. You spend 5 minutes a day on one of these things, you get 100% of that for sure. Okay? Here are some videos you can review. Tomorrow we're going to be talking about Reconstruction. These last couple of days we've been looking at the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment. So all of these videos are great. They're short and to the point. These are the things that we need to be practicing for our final. Okay? Remember, our final is just optional. It's encouraged because you're going to be taking the same test next year. But I'm not going to grade it for accuracy. It's going to be an online thing like Google Forms. I'm not going to have a printed test because I'm not going to have a way to get that back to you. So if you're in a position where you can't take it online, let me know and I'll get you a paper one and we'll figure out how we're going to do it, okay? But for most people, they have a phone or a computer or something that they can do a Google Form on, okay? So today I'm just going to read this real quick. We're going to answer those questions and then we're done for the day, okay? All right. Let me stop sharing. Here are the 4 questions. Number 1, which answer choice from the article expresses 2 ideas that would be most important to include in the summary of the article? The article is on the history of the 15th Amendment, so keep that in mind. Number 2, the central idea of the article is developed by what? So like the main idea, the theme, what's all about. Number 3, which of the following people or groups in this article would be most likely to agree with the idea that states should not be forced to allow African Americans the right to vote? Which of the following people or groups in the article would be most likely to agree with the idea that states should not be forced to allow African Americans the right to vote? Number 4, what is the most important reason why poll taxes and literacy tests were used in the South? Okay, so we briefly talked about this yesterday, how the 15th Amendment was an awesome thing, gave former slaves and other people, other men, the right to vote. But there was some, we talked about the pendulum, and it swung back, right? So they gave the rights and then they tried to pull them back. Okay, so the history of the 15th Amendment. 15th Amendment granted African American men the right to vote. It was passed by Congress in 1869 and formally adopted into the U.S. Constitution on March 30th, 1870. The amendment reads, "The right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude." Despite the amendment, by the late 1870s, various discriminatory practices were used to prevent African Americans from exercising their right to vote, especially in the South. After decades of discrimination, the Voting Rights Act of 1965 aimed to overcome legal barriers at state and local levels that denied blacks the right to vote under the 15th Amendment. 1965. That's 12 years before I was born. Okay, that's not that long ago. 1965. That set in for a minute. Okay. 1965, we did the Voting Rights Act. Okay. Reconstruction and the 15th Amendment. In 1867, following the American Civil War, the Republican-dominated U.S. Congress passed the first Reconstruction Act over President Andrew Johnson's veto. The act divided the South into 5 military districts and outlined how new governments were to be established, given that every adult male, regardless of race, was allowed to vote. A little pause here. If it was a Republican, why did they have to vote over Andrew Johnson? Andrew Johnson was the vice president under Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln, as you know, was assassinated, and then he became president. Andrew Johnson was put into the position of vice president to balance the ticket. Sometimes when somebody's more extreme, like Abraham Lincoln was at that time, they in the North liked him more than the South. They put somebody on there that had more Southern tendencies, right? Supported more the Southern agenda. And then we have this, and it balances the ticket, right? So you got Abraham Lincoln North, Andrew Johnson South. Abraham Lincoln assassinated, who becomes president? Andrew Johnson. Okay, and so even though that they were both he was considered a Republican because he was on the ticket. He didn't always agree with the Republican Party, and especially the idea of North and South. He sided with the South. Okay, so with the adoption of the 15th Amendment in 1870, a politically mobilized African American community joined with white allies in southern states to elect the Republican Party to power. At the time, Republicans had a more progressive, liberal agenda than Democrats. So we often say that they kind of flip-flopped in that area. So nowadays, Republicans would be considered more conservative and Democrats more liberal. But in the late 1800s, it was the opposite. Okay? They brought about profound changes across the South. By the late 1870s, all former Confederate states had been readmitted to the Union. That means that, remember, they seceded from the Union, meaning they didn't want to be part of our country. They said they were their own Confederate or their own country within this Confederacy. By 1870, we said, okay, you can come back. We never really gave them permission to leave. We fought a war over it, but by 1870, all had officially come back. And most were controlled by the Republican Party, thanks to the support of black voters. In the same year, Hiram Rhodes Revels, a Republican from Mississippi, became the first African American ever to sit in the U.S. Congress, who was elected to the U.S. Senate. Black Republicans never obtained political office in proportion to their overwhelming electoral majority, but Revels and a dozen other black men served in Congress during Reconstruction. More than 600 served in state legislatures and more held local offices. So after the Civil War, what a lot of people don't think about is that when it came to voters in the South, after the Civil War, when in 13th, 14th, 15th Amendments, black voters outnumbered white voters. But what happens? Let's see. Post-Reconstruction. So Reconstruction is really the 1870s. In the late 1870s, the Southern Republican Party vanished. And with the end of Reconstruction, Southern state governments effectively nullified the 14th Amendment. Nullified means kind of cancels or get rid of, which guaranteed citizenship and all its privileges to African Americans. They also revoked the 15th Amendment, stripping blacks in the South the right to vote. In the decades that followed, various discriminatory practices were used to prevent African Americans from exercising their voting rights. These tactics included poll taxes and literacy tests, along with intimidation and violence. The Voting Rights Act of 1965. The Voting Rights Act was signed into law by President Lyndon Johnson on August 6, 1965. It aimed to overcome legal barriers at the state and local levels that denied African Americans their right to vote under the 15th Amendment. The act banned the use of literacy tests, provided for federal oversight of voter registration in certain areas, and authorized the U.S. Attorney General to investigate the use of poll taxes in state and local elections. In 1964, the 24th Amendment made poll taxes illegal in federal elections. Poll taxes in state elections were banned in 1966 by the U.S. Supreme Court. After the passage of the Voting Rights Act, state and local enforcement of law was weak, and it often was ignored outright. This mainly occurred in the South, where the proportion of blacks was high, and their votes threatened existing political conditions. Still, the Voting Rights Act gave African American voters the legal means to challenge voting restrictions. It also helped to vastly improve voter turnout. So it's been a long, long fight for the 15th Amendment, and it's still not over. If you take a look at modern elections, there are still ways that people in certain groups are being, it's harder for them to vote for various reasons. This is going to come up in this election, I guarantee it. Pay close attention to the 15th Amendment and what it grants, and how the Voting Rights Act of 1965 plays a part into what we are going to see in this next election. Guarantee it. Okay. So answer those 4 questions, and that's it for today. Tomorrow we're going to take a closer look at Reconstruction. Okay, and 150 years after Reconstruction, see what it worked and what we're still fighting for as far as equality. Okay. Don't forget to prepare for your tests. Bill of Rights and character / naturalization all can be found either on Google Classroom or the Trivium homepage. See you later.